Right, everyone. Let me just make sure everyone can hear me. Everyone can see and hear me okay? I'll just check with someone in the chat. Yeah, cool. Thank you very much for the hands. If anyone wants to ask any questions as we go through, feel free. I'll try and answer them during it or right at the end. But today we're going to go through kind of how you can supercharge your Microsoft security stack through automation. Clearly, we're going to be talking about SenseOn and the Microsoft platform and how they can work together. Really today, I want you to kind of walk away from this session and being able to kind of understand how we can support you in your use of the Microsoft stack and how you can detect advanced threats without complex engineering or tuning, how you can kind of do far more advanced analytics than you may be able to do with kind of SIEMs and particularly Azure Sentinel and some of the complexities there, and how SIEMs are meant to help us achieve that kind of promised single pane of glass, and they haven't really achieved that. And we're going to talk about kind of how we can help with that. Very briefly about me, I'm the Director of Technology at SenseOn. I've been here over 5 years. Previously ran the threat hunt team within BT. I was the SOC manager at EE, and I've done the coolest, I think, incident response job in cybersecurity, where I used to fly out to oil rigs to do incident response work for them. There's a picture of me fishing off of an oil rig in the Egyptian Sea. Bunch of security qualifications. They're not that important because it's all practical experience really, but feel free to connect me on LinkedIn. My email's on there and I'll share those details at the end so you can kind of follow up should you wish to. So today we're going to be talking about the Microsoft security stack. Now, clearly, Microsoft is the market leader. This presentation is not about vendor bashing in any way. I'm not going to be kind of disparaging towards the Microsoft security stack at all. It's really talking about complementary offerings and how we can make their platform a bit more efficient. Everything I'm trying to talk about, I'm trying to give a fair assessment. Everything is done on the pricing that I've got from list pricing in UK pounds. You may have been able to negotiate a slightly better deal, but I've tried to be a fair representation of the costs and the products and the services. But clearly, you know, there is a lot of depth and breadth to the Microsoft platform. Today, we're going to be primarily talking about Azure Sentinel, or Azure if you're British, or Azure if you speak to Americans too often, and the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint security platform. Clearly, there is a lot of depth to the Microsoft security products, and they've got a massive amount of products, but really these are the two ones that we see, and these are the two centerpieces of most security operations teams. So to help level set everyone in the room, the first thing I want to talk about is Azure Sentinel, and kind of then we'll go into a bit about Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, just kind of helping people have a consistent level of understanding of their platforms and products. So Azure Sentinel is the Microsoft SIEM. When you ingest data into the Microsoft team, you basically have to pay for it. We'll go through certain situations when you don't need to pay for it in a moment, but there's two tiers to the logs that you ingest. You have analytic logs, and analytic logs, you can have free searches that run over them. You can have security analytics that could be pre-built or customized. By default, it will retain the logs for 90 days. You can retain it for longer, but it starts to cost a fair bit of money, depending on how long you want to keep that data for. But effectively, if you're running a security operations team, you need to be paying for analytic logs. There is a cheaper form of logs known as basic logs, but they cost you and they charge you money every single time you search for them. You can't really run automated analytics over them, so you can't really use basic logs within a kind of a security operations center for kind of day-to-day security analysis. Normally, people might keep basic logs if they have no intention of running searches over them, but you need to keep them for some compliance purposes. But they get very expensive if you start running searches over them or using them for analytics. The pricing we're going to be talking about today is only looking at analytic logs. We haven't considered basic log searches. The next thing is you do get some free data in Azure Sentinel. If you're a user of the Microsoft platform and you're using Microsoft Sentinel, Azure Sentinel, please do kind of make use of the free logs you get. So you get Azure activity logs, you get audit logs from Office 365, including all SharePoint activity, which is very useful to detect SharePoint threats, which is people speak to me about a fair bit. And you get alerts from the various Microsoft Defender security platforms, such as Defender for Cloud, Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Cloud Apps, etc. Now, if you're an absolute baller organization, you kind of gone all out on an E5 license. On an E5 license, you get 5 megs of additional log telemetry per day. it does ramp up, but you don't get a vast amount. You get things like some Azure directory audit logs and a few other logs, but it's not that much. It's only 5 megs per day. So the stuff that isn't free is kind of everything that's outside of that. So a lot of logs from the endpoint, a lot of logs from applications, kind of your infrastructure. Those are the kinds of services. So what I've done is I've got a rough approximate 1,000-person organization here. This is a pretty standard 1,000-person organization. This isn't a tech-heavy company, so this could be like a building services firm, could be a housing agency. This is a pretty kind of standard infrastructure for a 1,000-person firm. And I've tried to do an estimate of how many logs that these would generate. And this, I've used a calculator at the bottom from logpoint.com. There are lots of other calculators that are available and helping you determine how many logs you need. So for this, I've kind of speculated, because they're not very tech heavy. They've got 150 servers. 2/3 of them are going to be Windows, 1/3 will be Linux. And I've kind of speculated they're going to have 3 sites because they've got 1,000 people. So that seems relatively normal for that size. So if you wanted to get into using the log calculator at the bottom of the page, which is from a SIEM provider, if we wanted to get 1,000 end user devices, 100 Windows servers at what's called medium events per second score, we'll talk about EPS in a minute and kind of how that compared with the log sources and the log sizes can kind of adjust the amount of logs you need to ingest. About 50 Linux servers, and then because they've got 3 sites, I've speculated that they want to log 6 firewalls, maybe a perimeter firewall, an internal firewall, and 3 intrusion prevention systems at each site. And then they've got logs from 1,000 internal antivirus applications. That could be anything else. So based upon that calculator, I kind of ran it through the calculator, and it said to me that I would need to ingest 188 gigs of data into my SIEM per day. And we'll go through the pricing of what 188 gigs in Azure Sentinel, but that's the log requirement based upon that analysis there for the 1,000-person organization. You can run those stats through the calculator as well if you wish, or use it for your own organization. So you get commitment tiers in Azure Sentinel, particularly when you look at analytic logs. So on the commitment tiers, based upon 184 gigs a day, we'd probably be looking at a 200 gig per day commitment tier. And then for that, you get a 35% discount. So clearly you can kind of push this up right to the limit, but if you're a security engineer in that organization, you want to be making sure you're making use of the maximum up to the commitment tier and not going too far over it, because if you go over it, you suddenly start jumping from the £2.85 per gigabyte into the £4.42 per gigabyte. So it's quite a different balancing act to kind of make sure you're in the right tier, and it can get expensive if you don't do it right. But let's just take that £569. We're not going to pretend we're doing any balancing. We're just going to keep that as a flat rate, try and get that 35% commitment rate on Microsoft. Based upon that 1,000-person organization with a 35% discount, and I stress this is the list price, this is the list discount. If you're a huge organization, you may be able to negotiate other discounts, but based upon that, for most organizations, they'd be looking at a committed spend with Microsoft of 200 grand a year just for the logs in there. Now, that's the kind of logs that are going in there, and you might have been looking at some of your logs internally going, my logs are a lot smaller. So I'm going to talk through how this problem is getting worse and logs are getting bigger and logs are getting more expensive. So if you do any research, if you get, it's certainly my research and prep for this session, I'm going in how big is a log file. I was trying to go back in time, looking at some of the logs I looked at back in the past, because I'm sure they looked a lot simpler in the past. And if you did some research, any articles that are 10 plus years ago, they talk about the average raw event, so raw entry in a log file being about 200 bytes. Now, any network equipment, I didn't realize this, is actually limited to the log file size of being 1,024 bytes. That's because network equipment will send its logs over syslog. Syslog is UDP based, and because it's UDP based, it has to pick within the maximum transmissible unit of an IP packet effectively. So with all the headers, they limited that to be 1,024 bytes. Now, Windows have kind of exceeded this. If you've looked at Windows event logs, you'll know they're very large. You need to be very, very lucky to kind of fit that in 1,024 bytes. But the Windows event log has a maximum log size of 32 kilobytes. Now, just to stress, this is the raw event. The raw event is not what you're going to be storing on your SIEM.
you store in your SIEM something called the normalized event. The reason why you store the normalized event is because when you ingest a record into your SIEM, you need to map out the key parameters. So you need to map out and go, this is the source IP address, this is the username, this is the system I collected it from. That process is called normalization. You might do other things, like you might do some like geo-IP enrichment. Basically, you map it to that schema, you map the key fields, but often you still need to store the original record because you might not have mapped every single field. So because of that, we find in most cases, when you map the schema correctly, it at least double the size of the normalized event. If you're doing a lot of enrichment, making it better, it can triple the size in some cases we've seen. So bearing in mind, if you're looking at a log file, that log file will triple or double as you put it into your SIEM because you're paying for your SIEM storage on the normalized event, not the raw event. So we see it's very difficult actually to determine how big your log file or your SIEM needs to be. And it's very difficult to calculate even if you look at the raw log size. And this will change and increase over time as your security engineering team gets more efficient. What we see is kind of a common planning assumption across a number of customers. And this, bear in mind, this is kind of very vague, very wet finger in the air, but still the 600 bytes per raw log seems to be reasonable, but it kind of means that for 1,500 bytes per log file, as a rough planning estimate, you can say for 1,000 logs, that could be 1.5 megs of normalized logs per 1,000 logs. But remember, most logs are completely useless. When we look at logs, they can be all sorts of things. If you've ever tried to look at Windows event logs for troubleshooting a security issue, you'll find that, things like applications failed or just weird stuff like weird driver errors, and you've got no knowledge or understanding whether that relates to your security issue. And looking at the log calculators, about 5 to 10 years ago, we used to do SIEM pricing based upon measuring EPS or events per second. So because of that, today, there's a lot of calculators look at the events per second rather than the storage size, which is the current way that most SIEM, including Azure Sentinel, prices their products. They don't do it in events per second or EPS anymore. So at the time, kind of looking at Windows servers, a low volume Windows server would be determined to generate 1 event per second, and a high volume Windows server would be determined to generate 7 events per second. That would mean that the small end, the low end of the planning assumption would be 86,400 events per day from a low EPS Windows server, or it could be 600,000 events per second. That means at the top end, you'd be looking at 1 gigabyte per day on average. Now, I know some systems will generate vast more logs of this. I know some systems which will generate like gigs and gigs and gigs of logs every day. And if you've ever had to be in the unfortunate position like I have, where you're trying to manage disk storage and log rotation, logs can be absolutely crazy on some systems. But this is a very vague planning assumption, which every organization is different, but you can use this as guidance. So guidance, 1,000 logs, 1.5 megabytes is a rough average. But the costs of that, and we've gone through that example, and how that example is going to getting worse over time, but that is purely looking at some of this technology cost of logs. So you paying for those logs in Azure Sentinel. But you've got other costs. You need to to make use of them, to develop useful analytics. You need to have really competent security engineers. You need to have really good security analysts. And you need to have an IT operations team, which is going to support you getting the logs there in the first place. I see loads of SIEM programs fail because people go, you know what, yeah, we're security, I'm going to tell you what to do. And if they don't work very efficiently with the CIO or the IT ops team, they're just not going to prioritize, and they're never going to get you the logs, and they're not going to do that iterative work to make sure you've got the right detail in the first place. And then you've got to build your business processes internally of how are you going to manage those detections? How are you going to do the tuning? How are you going to bring on new sources? How are you going to integrate your SIEM and your technology platform into your new projects that you're delivering? Because your organization won't be standing still. It's going to be building new servers, new systems, and you need to figure out how you're going to cover those. So those are some of the challenges. We'll come back a bit later to how SenseOn helps with them. But next thing, MDE, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Its names keeps changing over time, so I'm going to be using the term Microsoft Defender for Endpoint because that's as far as I'm aware, the current official terminology for it. Now there's 2 plans for this. Defender Plan 1. Defender Plan 1 is the more basic antivirus level component. It's got a few manual response actions.
And you've got Defender Plan 2, which is the more full-fat EDR. It's got a few vulnerability management features. It's much more complete. I'm not doing the kind of components of Defender Plan 2 justice here, because I don't want to, we could be here a while. But Defender Plan 2 is a good broad product. Now, often we find that the kind of choice of whether they go for Microsoft Defender Plan 1 or Defender Plan 2 isn't driven by IT security teams. It's often driven by core IT budgets. And this is because often this is bundled into other purchases. So kind of what Office license does your CFO want? And he's probably going to, or she is probably going to want a pretty decent kind of Excel package. They're going to go for the top tier because they know Microsoft products really, really well. So we find actually the kind of decision has sometimes in some organizations been made for the IT team, but for the security team. So if you've got an E3 license, you're probably going to be on Defender Plan 1. If you've got an E5 license, you're probably going to be on Defender Plan 2. So E3, the basic AV, E5, the more advanced kind of EDR capability. Now, you can buy extensions. You can, legally Microsoft have to debundle these. They do that. Might be worth looking into, but generally on the whole, kind of E3 is always going to be Plan 1 on the whole. So we talked about very briefly some of the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint offerings. We've talked about kind of Azure Sentinel, some of the costs, because that can get uncontrolled in terms of costs very, very quickly. And then you've got this tightrope that you're walking of balancing of visibility, detection, efficiency, and cost, which I kind of envy the security teams that need to kind of manage that, particularly with tight budgets, because it gets out of hand very, very quickly. So how can SenseOn manage this, and what are other ways of kind of assessing the kind of value that you can do in terms of those logs? So normally when we work on this kind of engagement, we come with a customer who kind of expresses they've got pain with Azure Sentinel. What we'll do is we'll come in. This could be the same for Splunk. This could be used for any other kind of SIEM provider out there. We look at it and we start looking at what are the most voluminous logs that you're getting in there. We'll start with them because they're the most expensive ones. And for each one of those, we're going to look at it and going, right, even before we worry about the attacks, we kind of think, what's the value in these logs? Why are they being stored? We see that sometimes some organizations just store logs because they've always stored them. That's the way they've always done them. I think the classic example is people who decide to log every single entry inside like an internal firewall, or maybe a perimeter file, every single line in kind of accesses and denied. And that used to be the way we used to do security 5 to 10 years ago. But like in the model of, you think of how many the events per second that you're going to be generating from a firewall log, even though they're probably going to be smaller logs because they're going to have to be compliant with the RFC I mentioned earlier, which kind of has to pass it within syslog, that just gets absolutely bonkers in terms of storage. So kind of why are we doing this in the first place? Then we want to think, what are the attacks that we're looking at? We often like to break it down and put another framework, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then we do a comparison by going, this is the log source, this is how much you're paying, you think there's value in that individual log source. So based upon that, kind of is SenseOn going to provide a capability for looking at those tactics, techniques, and procedures in that area? If so, you can drop that potentially from your original log source, and that's the saving if you were to buy SenseOn you could do. It could be that actually, no, SenseOn doesn't have a capability there, so you could make a decision to retain it or do an assessment of the value. And then it also could be, we got another option where we could reduce the amount of logs, and we could act as effectively as some form of filter to kind of reduce those logs for that. This is a real customer we work with, obviously kind of obscured a couple of details, but this customer, we were looking at kind of how many logs they were generating. We've changed a few of the details, but on the whole, the figures are all accurate. But this customer was generating 125 gigs of data into their system. We looked at all the logs they were producing. We looked at why they were doing it, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and we calculated that with SenseOn we'd be able to kind of reduce the total volumetric logs by about 61% and reduce their Microsoft Sentinel cost by 57%. With the figures on there. So they were saving every day £353, and per month it was £10,000 a year by just kind of switching to Sentinel. So that's the cost problem, but really there's other issues in terms of kind of the data and how that's managed in SIEMs more generally. So right now, today, you're probably using a system. If you're using Azure Sentinel, using another tool like that, you're going to be having logs and telemetry from processes that are running on endpoints. You're also going to be having other telemetry sources from logs that you're picking up from network events. So maybe that is things like IDSs, IPSs. So on the whole, we see kind of EDR has taken the space of providing the vast amount of logging from endpoints. You're still going to get a lot of value depending on the log sources you get from doing things like other things in Windows event logs. You might restrict that to Windows event IDs if you want to kind of reduce those costs a bit further. But on the whole, EDR is the primary source of understanding now what's going on the endpoint. In terms of the complexity of networks, because NetFlow, IPFix, those ways of understanding of what's going on the network are challenging. They don't necessarily work with remote workers. They don't work well in cloud environments. We see kind of the number one way of getting network visibility today is through an NDR or network detection and response platform. And we see most organizations try and bring this together into a SIEM. The problem is right now those are very disparate data sources. So if you're looking at some telemetry from your network detection and response tool, it's very, very difficult and you can't really pin it and analyze it back to the process that's running on that individual endpoint. So let's say I saw a connection to a command and control server. If I saw a connection to a CNC server, I just wouldn't know what was going on that endpoint at that time. I might have some other logs, but I wouldn't know that came from PowerShell, that came from, that came from Chrome, and it was visiting a web page. There's no linkage between those individual data sources. And that's kind of what I was very frustrated with when I was running security operations in the past, is seeing these weird and wonderful things on the network because everything's encrypted, everything's a bit odd, and going, what was actually the root cause behind that individual event? So we deploy a single piece of software, which runs on Mac, it runs on Windows, it runs on Linux, and that provides network visibility. So we were the first vendor in the world, as far as I'm aware, that did full deep packet inspection on most enterprise protocols on the endpoint. And we linked that to the process that launched it and the user information. So that enabled us with that information to be like, show me every single network connection that was created by a privileged user going to the internet. Or I've seen this connection to this command and control server, show me the network connection with the full DPI and the parent process and the command line arguments to launch that. You can start to see how you can do analytics in a very, very different way. And that kind of means we can track and see the traffic across the network, and we can kind of glue that network information to the endpoint information in a way that is just really, really difficult using kind of tools like Azure SenseOn. And because we're generating that data not necessarily from log files, but we're doing it from deep packet inspection, we're doing it from our own process collection, it's consistent not only across your estate, across every single system, but it's consistent across kind of all of our customers. And because it's consistent across all of our customers, those analytics genuinely work really, really effectively out of the box. All sorts of things, UEBA, rules and signatures, deception methods, machine learning, threat intel, stream analysis. We do loads and loads of individual analytics. And then when we have loads of individual security options, including pulling alerts in through the Microsoft Graph API, so we're pulling all the alerts from Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and the other platforms, we will look for key parameters like the IP address, the username, and we'll try and correlate that to kind of our information, and we'll build that into a sequence of individual events from SenseOn telemetries combined with the Microsoft telemetry. And that kind of means that when we do have an incident, we can kind of very, very quickly map from that network, from the Microsoft alert to our own telemetry, which wasn't necessarily available in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and may not be logged into your SIEM, and we can kind of provide that consistent kind of investigative process. And that means we can kind of triangulate and sequence those cases end to end, and we provide you with a full visibility of all that data. If you're a proper SOC nerd like me and you like running queries on raw data, we provide full visibility. We've got a full SQL database, so you can kind of access all of that information directly if you want to. But if you want to sit back in the kind of much easier user interface waiting for detection to be surfaced, you can. But we can, we provide all of the data we collect, which is something like nearly 130 tables of information, which is a flat fee. It's not like the Azure Sentinel pricing where you're paying on ingest costs. And then we can wrap that up with managed detection and response, and we've got other preventative features like isolation and kind of mitigating it in certain circumstances. So, Sentinel is a good platform. It can be used very, very well. There's a balance to play in terms of making sure it's right. It needs a certain level of expertise to use effectively. But we see three problems. We've got the problem one. We've got the issues and the costs of kind of ingesting additional log sources. You have to normalize that. You have to manage that. You also need to kind of, problem two is kind of, you need to manage that. You need to manage the detections, create them, tune them, adjust them, adapt them over time. And then if you don't do those two things correctly, you either can't complete the security investigation, or you're dealing with too many security investigations. So your SOC just gets a bit overwhelmed. So basically how SenseOn kind of recommends we would support a customer who's using Azure Sentinel is keep Azure Sentinel as the center of your security operations. We will come in and deploy our security operations. So we will deploy our SenseOn sensor software across a wide number of systems. This provides this unified visibility, mapping network events to endpoint events to user information. We basically provide really, really good advanced network detection and response visibility with that process details and other details that you're not probably going to get in certain circumstances on Defender. We'll also kind of identify that based upon the logs we're collecting, you probably need to, there aren't as many logs that you need to store. So you can maybe able to, in some cases, turn off things like your firewall logs, your NetFlow logs, because we're getting this from our own sensor software on all the systems, no matter where they are. There's all sorts of things that you can kind of reduce and you may not need to store because we're storing that in kind of our central database. Now, there are some things that we're not going to store. I'm not going to be here and say kind of SenseOn's going to be able to provide every single security solution. It's clearly not. But the 80-20 rule kind of really does apply. And for most security use cases, which map back to things like initial access, latch-on movement, C2, exfil, impact, SenseOn will be able to provide that, but there will be custom apps, there'll be custom things that you might be worried about. Continue doing them in Azure Sentinel. We will also pull in details from the Microsoft sources through the Graph API, and we'll push that with our own enrichment of our own data from data we're pulling in from our unified data model, creating our own observations, and we can feed that back from our own observations back into Azure Sentinel. So kind of you get far, there's far less work that you need to do. And then finally, kind of in terms of the kind of business case, that means we're able to provide far better detections. We're using our advanced network detection and response capability, giving you that network visibility. We can reduce the workload that you and your teams are having to do. So your SOCs and your security engineering teams aren't completely overwhelmed with tuning and management and walking that tightrope of cost versus efficiency and making sure your SOC isn't kind of overly burdened. We can reduce the data ingestion costs that are going to Azure Sentinel. I know that's a concern for many organizations in trying to kind of manage that predictable budgets. And ultimately, I believe we're going to find far more threats using our approach for most organizations where you don't have teams of hundreds of security people. We're a very good solution for the mid-market, especially, and kind of lower end of the enterprise. So kind of, but this is a real customer. They only provided kind of Sentinel's providing only 40% of the visibility. They had a legacy NDR vendor upon the state. They had kind of a very flat network architecture. They basically had loads of noise, and Sentinel was costing them a load of money. We worked with them using Sentinel. We kind of helped them work on a cloud migration journey because they no longer needed to worry about where their assets were. They could run their assets remotely, any cloud, on-prem, remote, and get that network visibility. We're able to give them really efficient network detections, manage the automated work process, and kind of the cost savings that will kind of work through and agree with the customer at the bottom. But in terms of overall costs and kind of, we're able to deliver their security operations at a reduced budget because we were able to rip out and replace and reduce Sentinel costs. Even with the added costs of SenseOn, they were still making a net saving over the course of 3 years. And then just finally, in terms of where I see the market going and kind of how things are changing, back about 5 years ago, you would do endpoint monitoring through antivirus and EDR. You would do network monitoring historically through IDSs, IPSs, although arguably I don't think they've ever worked effectively. Things like firewall logs, and then kind of network detection and response tools came around, and we tried to converge this together into SIEMs. Right now, I don't think that's working effectively. So because of that, other products on the far right have come out. We've seen SOARs come out to kind of, I think, deal with the failures of what we expected the SIEM to do, and they haven't really done. Some people and other vendors are talking about the term XDR. I'm still very dubious about the term. I see many vendors kind of saying that they're XDR, but I don't think that's a defined term yet. I'm seeing EDR vendors who are adding SIEM integration saying it. I'm seeing SIEM vendors who are adding cloud integration saying it. I don't think that's going to kind of achieve it because it's not a clearly defined term. I'm also seeing service-based companies like MDR companies, MSSP companies, kind of try and bring and manage these different tools together. SenseOn is really kind of bringing the gap between the endpoint logs, the network logs, and converging that together and interacting with things like the Microsoft security stack. And I genuinely feel like SenseOn is the converged future of detection and response, which is like great for any companies who are MSSPs and kind of any companies who are looking to change how they do their internal security offering as well. So kind of very in summary, the Microsoft security stack is really robust. It can be expensive if you're not managing effectively. There remains this data problem even if you do this really, really effectively. You can't map that network information to the endpoint information, and that just kills security investigations, being able to link that. You need skilled resource, engineers, analysts to kind of do this effectively, and kind of SenseOn could provide additional capabilities and additional visibility, which you might not be able to do using other platforms. We can reduce that Sentinel log ingestion costs, which will massively improve your complexity, and you're going to get the benefits of our analytics out the box, which means kind of you can run this very, very quickly. We have customers who can deploy this in half a day, roll this out through something like Intune to all their estate. Maybe they roll out through Jamf Pro if they got macOS systems, or Ansible or Terraform if they're using a Linux system. But like genuinely, deployment is a breeze, and you can we'll hook into that Graph API. That's it. My contact details are on there. Feel free to kind of ask me any questions you want. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me an email, and I'd be glad to kind of help. That's everything that I wanted to go through. I haven't got any pressing questions from anyone, but I'll give you a moment to answer a question, and then we'll end it there. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated you spending 30-something minutes with me. So cheers, thanks. Where I find out they haven't turned on the Q&A, but I'll have a look at that later. Nothing received. So thank you very much for your time. Cheers. Thank you.